Take off that medal. Sir. The words echoed through the courtroom like a challenge, slicing the quiet air in two. But Arthur Hale, a quiet man in his 60s, a veteran, with deep lines etched by both time and honor, didn't flinch. He rose from the jury box, the Purple Heart pinned proudly to his chest, a silent testament to decades of service. The judge's command might have carried weight in that room, but outside, in the heart of Maple Falls, a different kind of strength was gathering. A strength born of sacrifice, of quiet courage, and the promise that dignity is never surrendered, no matter who's watching. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sun broke over Maple Falls with a gentle glow, painting the courthouse in warm gold and soft shadows. Daniel Brooks stood at the clerk's desk, shuffling paperwork into neat stacks, his fingers brushing worn manila folders. He'd been here for 3 years now, a young clerk still learning the rhythm of this old building, the way its floors creaked and walls held echoes of so many voices. Outside, the trees blushed red and gold, their leaves catching in the breeze like tiny flags of autumn. Inside, the courthouse came to life in small ways, polished shoes on marble floors, hushed voices trading gossip, the occasional cough breaking the quiet. Daniel watched the people file in one by one, each carrying a story they probably wished was theirs alone. The farmers and storekeepers who filled the rows of pews looked out of place in this room of marble and oak. Daniel's eyes followed them, a man in a checkered shirt clutching his hat, a woman in a navy dress with a look of wary defiance, a boy no older than 17, shifting from foot to foot. They came for jury duty or small claims or something bigger, though none of them seemed to know quite how to act in a place like this. And then he saw the old man, Arthur Hale. The name was written in the day's schedule, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. Arthur walked with a slow, deliberate limp, each step measured, each breath calm. He wore his uniform like a second skin-pressed jacket, brass buttons gleaming, medals carefully pinned over his heart. But the Purple Heart, it stood out the most, catching the morning light in a quiet blaze of color. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest as Arthur passed, the way the old soldier's shoulders stayed square, the way his chin lifted just a little higher. It wasn't arrogance, it was something older, deeper. The people in the hallway fell silent as he walked by. Some looked away, uncomfortable in the face of that battered uniform. Others nodded, a small gesture of respect they probably didn't even realize they were giving. Arthur reached the courtroom doors and paused. For a moment, Daniel wondered if he'd stop altogether, if he'd turn around and walk back out into the sunlit morning. But he didn't. He pushed the door open with one hand, cane tapping softly at his side, and stepped inside. The courtroom was cold in the way only old buildings can be, a stillness that pressed in on every breath. Daniel felt it too, the hush that fell over the room as Arthur entered. The judge's bench loomed at the far end, dark wood polished to a near mirror shine, and at its center sat Judge Charles Beckett. Beckett was a man of rigid posture and sharp eyes, his black robe fitting like a suit of armor. He didn't look up as Arthur walked down the center aisle, not at first. But then, as Arthur reached the table reserved for potential jurors, Beckett's gaze lifted and locked onto the medals across the old man's chest. His expression didn't change, but Daniel saw it in the small flicker of his jaw, the way he didn't like what he saw. Arthur took his seat at the end of the row, back straight, hands folded on his lap. Daniel watched from his desk, the clerk's log open but forgotten in front of him. He could feel the tension in the air, sharp and electric, as if the room itself was holding its breath. When the time came, Beckett cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the hushed space. "Mr. Hale," he said, each word clipped and precise, "this courtroom maintains strict decorum. Your military regalia, while honorable, is not appropriate for these proceedings. Remove it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel felt a chill, though the room was warm enough. Arthur didn't move. He lifted his chin and looked straight at the judge. "With respect, Your Honor," Arthur said quietly, his voice carrying without effort. This purple heart is not a piece of decoration. It is a testament to the men I served beside, and to those who never came home. His voice was low, even, but each word felt weighty like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Beckett's eyes narrowed. This is a court of law. Mr. Hale, he said, his tone growing colder. We cannot have jurors displaying symbols that might sway opinion or sentiment. Remove it or face contempt. A hush swept through the room. Daniel's heart beat louder in his chest as he watched Arthur draw in a slow breath. The old man's hand moved to the metal, fingers brushing at once like a prayer or a promise. I wore this in service of the Constitution, Arthur said softly, and I will not remove it here. His words weren't defiant, but they weren't a request either. They were a line in the sand. Judge Beckett's jaw worked, a muscle in his cheek jumping once, then still. Very well, he said, voice tight. Bailiff, remove Mr. Hale from this courtroom and record his refusal. The bailiff stepped forward, hesitation flickering in his eyes. Arthur rose slowly, using his cane to push himself upright. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He just stood, shoulders straight, and let them guide him out. Daniel watched him go, a flicker of something pride, maybe sparking in the quiet of his mind. He glanced around the room, at the jurors shifting in their seats, at the silence that had taken hold of everyone. In that moment, Daniel knew he'd witnessed something that would not be easily forgotten. Arthur Hale disappeared through the heavy oak doors, leaving behind a hush so thick it seemed to settle into the wood itself. Judge Beckett cleared his throat again, his gavel tapping once, twice, to break the spell. Proceed, he said sharply, but no one moved right away. Daniel lowered his head, eyes tracing the open ledger on his desk. His pen hovered, waiting for the next thing to write, but in the quiet, he realized something deeper. This was more than a single morning standoff. It was the start of something neither side could control. And as he looked up, at the door that had closed behind Arthur Hale, Daniel felt the weight of that understanding settle deep in his bones. The day had only just begun, but already the story had taken root, and it would not be silenced. The doors closed behind Arthur Hale with a final, muffled thud. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, his fingers tightening around the edge of his ledger. The courtroom seemed colder now, though nothing had changed except the absence of one old soldier. Judge Beckett resumed the proceedings with the same clipped authority he'd always wielded, but the air in the room felt different. Every shuffle of paper, every cough, seemed louder in the silence Arthur had left behind. Daniel saw it in the way people shifted in their seats, the unease that clung to them, the quiet questions no one dared to ask aloud. When the session ended, Daniel packed up his files slowly, feeling the weight of the morning settle into his shoulders. He stepped into the corridor, the marble floor cool beneath his worn dress shoes. Outside, the world carried on as usual, people talking in low voices, the sun glinting off parked cars. But something had cracked open in that courtroom. Daniel felt it, a small fracture that might spread if given time. He made his way down the steps just in time to see Arthur emerge from the courthouse, flanked by two deputies. They didn't touch him, didn't push him, just walked beside him like silent sentinels. Arthur's head was high, his shoulders back, and for a moment, Daniel thought he looked taller than he had before. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his eyes sweeping over the small gathering that had already formed. A few bystanders paused mid-conversation, phones clutched in their hands. Some offered a nod of quiet respect. Others just watched, curious but silent. Arthur took a breath, the early autumn wind ruffling the edges of his uniform. Then he turned and walked away, each step measured, his cane tapping against the pavement. Daniel stood on the steps and watched him go, a flicker of pride and something else, something close to sorrow stirring in his chest. The story didn't end there. By midday, word had spread through Maple Falls like wildfire. Whispers in the diner, muted conversations in the library, a headline on the front page of the Maple Falls Gazette: veteran removed from jury for wearing Purple Heart. Daniel felt the weight of those words each time he saw them. He could almost hear Arthur's voice echoing in the quiet of the courthouse hallways. It wasn't just about one medal or one courtroom. It was about something deeper, something that refused to be ignored. That afternoon, Daniel sat at his desk, head bent over the day's docket, when he heard the soft click of heels on the marble floor. He looked up to see a woman standing there, a reporter's notepad held loosely in one hand. Emily Chen. She wore a simple gray coat and a calm, determined expression that told him she wasn't there by accident. "Daniel Brooks," she asked, her voice gentle but direct. He nodded, setting his pen aside. She introduced herself quickly, no preamble, no unnecessary words. "I'm writing about what happened this morning," she said quietly. "Would you be willing to talk to me?" Daniel hesitated, glancing around the office as if the walls themselves might overhear. But something in Emily's eyes told him she was listening, not just recording, and so he nodded. They stepped outside, the autumn breeze carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Emily asked careful questions: how Arthur had walked in, what the judge had said, the way the room had gone silent. Daniel answered honestly, each word chosen with care. He watched her jot down notes, her brow furrowed in thought. When she finished, she closed her notebook with a soft snap. "Thank you," she said, her voice warm. "Stories like this, they matter." Daniel watched her walk away, her coat flaring slightly in the wind. He didn't know what her article would say exactly, but he knew it would carry more weight than the murmurs in the hallway ever could. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Maple Falls, the courthouse steps were empty again, but Daniel could feel the shift in the air, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something more. Across town, in a small house with weathered siding, Arthur sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the wood worn smooth by years of use. His daughter, Sandra, sat across from him, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on her coffee mug. Beside her, Malik, her son, leaned forward, his eyes bright with a mixture of worry and determination. "Dad," Sandra said softly, her voice catching, "why won't you just take the medal off? You know how these people are. You know what they'll do." Arthur looked at her, his gaze steady, calm. "They can take me out of that courtroom," he said quietly, "but they can't take away what this means." Malik leaned back, exhaling slowly. "They're saying crazy things on the radio. Grandpa, calling you a troublemaker, a liar." Arthur's lips twitched, a faint echo of a smile. "They can say what they like," he replied. "I know what's true. That's enough for me." Sandra reached across the table, her hand closing over his. "You've always been stubborn," she murmured, her eyes soft with worry. Arthur's fingers tightened around hers, a silent promise. "And I've always known when to stand my ground." That night, as the first stars pricked the sky above Maple Falls, the story kept growing. Emily's article went live on the Gazette's website just after midnight. By morning, it had been shared dozens of times, each new share a small ripple in the quiet pond of this small town. And in the days that followed, the ripples turned to waves. Men and women, some in faded uniforms, some in plain clothes, began arriving at the courthouse steps. They stood in silent rows, medals pinned to their chests, the autumn wind tugging at their jackets and the brims of their hats. Daniel watched them from the window of the clerk's office, each new arrival a testament to something he couldn't quite name. They didn't shout, they didn't demand, they just stood, patient and resolute, their silence louder than any protest could ever be. Each morning, more joined them. An old Marine with a silver star, a young woman in Air Force blues, her hair braided tight beneath her cap, a man who carried nothing but an old battered flag, its colors still bright against the gray sky. Daniel stepped outside once, just to see them up close. The weight of their presence settled over him like a blanket, warm, heavy, impossible to ignore. He found himself standing a little straighter, his own breath slowing in quiet reverence. They came for Arthur Hale, but more than that, Daniel realized, they came for the promise that no sacrifice should be erased by a single man's command. They came because dignity, real dignity, can't be ordered away. At night, the lights in the clerk's office stayed on later than usual. Daniel worked quietly, filing papers, his mind replaying every moment of that first confrontation. But outside, he could see them still, those silent figures who refused to leave, their metals catching the glow of the street lamps like embers in the dark. And in the stillness, Daniel understood that this was just the beginning. The town of Maple Falls had always been a quiet place, a place where nothing much changed, but now it was waking up. And the story of Arthur Hale was no longer just his own, it belonged to all of them. As the days passed, the quiet strength of the veterans standing outside the courthouse became impossible to ignore, but so did the undercurrent of something darker. Daniel heard it first in the whispers that slipped between conversations, like wind through cracked window. Rumors, accusations that Arthur Hale's record wasn't real, that his medals were nothing more than costume jewelry pinned to an old jacket. Some said he'd never served at all. Daniel watched the way these lies spread, seeping through the town like a slow-moving fog. He saw them written on hastily printed flyers left on benches, heard them spoken in half-finished sentences at the diner. They were careful not to say them too loud, but they said them often enough. Judge Beckett never spoke of it publicly, but Daniel noticed the way his expression hardened whenever Arthur's name was mentioned. He noticed the quiet meetings in Beckett's chambers, the doors closed tight, the murmur of voices behind the thick oak. He saw men in tailored suits slip in and out, their faces set in careful masks. At first, Daniel didn't know what to do with what he was seeing. He wasn't a lawyer, he was just a clerk, but he couldn't pretend he didn't see it. So he watched, and he remembered. Arthur's family felt the strain almost immediately. Sandra's job at the local community center was suddenly in question. Her supervisor, a man she'd known for years, pulled her aside one morning, his eyes darting nervously. He told her there were complaints, that maybe it would be better if she took some time off. Malik, too, faced quiet threats. His professors began to question his academic integrity, though he'd never given them a reason to doubt him before. He came home one afternoon, his face pale, hands trembling with frustration. "They're saying I forged my scholarship forms," he told his grandfather. "I've never even thought of such a thing." Arthur listened in silence, his face unreadable. He didn't raise his voice or slam his fist on the table. He just nodded once, as if he'd known this was coming. Sandra watched him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Dad, how can you be so calm?" she asked, her voice shaking. Arthur looked at her then, his gaze steady. "Because this isn't the first time," he said quietly, "and because I will not let them steal my dignity. Not again." Daniel wrote it all down in his ledger, though it was never meant to be part of the court's record. He wrote it because it mattered, because one day, someone would need to know how far those in power had gone to protect themselves. In the middle of it all, Emily Chen kept digging. Her first article had been careful, measured, but the next one pulled no punches. She published a detailed investigation complete with court documents and interviews exposing the quiet, insidious patterns in Beckett's courtroom. She laid out the numbers for everyone to see, how black defendants were more than twice as likely to be dismissed from jury pools, how sentencing was harsher for those who didn't look like Beckett's golf partners, how Arthur Hale's quiet stand had simply pulled back the curtain on a system that had always been stacked against people like him. The morning the article went live, Daniel watched Emily walk up the courthouse steps, her eyes clear and unwavering. She didn't flinch when Beckett's clerk tried to block her from entering. She didn't waver when lawyers muttered behind her back. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she wasn't about to stop. The backlash was swift. Some called her a liar, a troublemaker, but others, many others, stood up for her, for Arthur, for what was right. By the end of the week, the courthouse was surrounded not just by veterans, but by neighbors. Men and women who'd never worn a uniform, but understood what was at stake. They brought coffee and blankets for the veterans who kept their silent vigil. They left handwritten notes of thanks taped to the courthouse doors. Inside, Daniel watched as Judge Beckett's composure began to crack. He barked at clerks over small mistakes. He shuffled papers with an edge of panic that hadn't been there before. Daniel saw him one afternoon, standing alone in his chambers, staring at the wall as if he could will it to swallow him whole. The tipping point came when the state's Judicial Review Board announced a special hearing, a formal inquiry into Judge Beckett's conduct. The date was set for a Monday morning. The courthouse would be open to the public, and everyone would have a chance to see the evidence laid bare. That morning, Daniel arrived early. The sky was still streaked with dawn light, but already the steps were crowded. Veterans in uniform, civilians in jeans and work boots, students with cameras slung over their shoulders. They all stood together, a silent line of witnesses. Daniel slipped inside, the quiet of the courthouse a sharp contrast to the murmurs outside. He settled into his usual place by the clerk's desk, his ledger open and ready. But today, he wouldn't be writing docket notes. Today, he would be writing history. When Arthur Hale walked through the door, the room fell silent. He wore the same uniform he'd worn on that first day, the metals shining softly in the morning light. His limp was a little more pronounced, but his back was straight as a young man's. Sandra and Malik walked behind him, their eyes fierce with pride. Emily Chen stood near the front row, notebook in hand, a small recorder clipped to her collar. And behind her, Daniel saw the faces of Maple Falls, old and young, black and white, each one holding its breath. Arthur paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room. Then he walked forward, his cane tapping steadily on the floor. Each step echoed in the quiet, a sound Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Judge Beckett sat at the bench, flanked by two members of the review board. He looked smaller than Daniel had ever seen him. His eyes flickered once to Arthur, then away. The lead investigator cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. This hearing is convened to determine whether Judge Charles Beckett has violated the ethical standards of this court, he said. His words were precise, each one cutting through the air like a blade. Arthur took his seat, his shoulders still straight, his expression unshaken. Daniel watched him, a quiet awe building in his chest. He thought of all the times he'd seen men shrink under the weight of power. But not Arthur. Not today. As the testimony began, Daniel kept his pen moving, capturing every word. He saw the evidence laid bare: case files, statistics, the quiet testimony of those who had been silenced for too long. And through it all, Arthur sat silent, his eyes never wavering, his hand resting on the metal over his heart. Outside, the veterans and neighbors held their ground, their silence as powerful as any speech. Inside, the walls of the old courthouse seemed to lean in, listening, because this wasn't just about Arthur Hale anymore. It was about all of them, and it was about the kind of town Maple Falls wanted to be when the dust finally settled. The days that followed the hearing felt like the slow unfolding of a long-held breath. In the courtroom, Judge Beckett sat rigid and silent as the review board read out its findings. They spoke of patterns of discrimination hidden behind gavel and robe, of a system that had let power fester instead of serving the people it claimed to protect. Emily Chen's articles were cited by name, each one a quiet hammer that had cracked the marble walls of Beckett's authority. The testimony of the veterans who stood outside, of the neighbors who spoke of fairness and decency, it all built a weight no man could ignore. And in the end, there was no place for Beckett to hide. He resigned 2 days later, the official statement as cold and formal as his courtroom had always been. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a signature on a piece of paper, and the slow fade of his name from the brass plaque outside the courthouse doors. Daniel watched as it was removed, the screws coming loose with an echo that felt almost like a final punctuation mark. A week later, the court issued a statement of its own, an apology, clear and direct, for once. They vacated every contempt charge against Arthur Hale, stripped the record clean as if it had never been written in the first place. They didn't mention the medal or the morning it had all begun, but Daniel knew what it meant. On a bright Saturday morning, the town gathered at Maple Falls Park to honor Arthur. There was no stage, no grand speeches, just a small platform beneath an old oak tree, its leaves turning gold in the autumn light. Daniel stood near the back, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching as neighbors filled the space with quiet reverence. Sandra and Malik were there, standing close beside Arthur, their eyes shining with something beyond relief, something closer to pride. Emily Chen stood off to one side, her notepad closed for once, her expression gentle and unguarded. The veterans lined the edge of the park in crisp lines, medals pinned to their chests, their silence speaking louder than any words. When Arthur stepped forward, the small crowd fell completely still. He wore the same uniform, the same cane tapping against the wooden platform. The Purple Heart shone softly against his jacket, a single point of color that seemed to gather every eye in the park. The mayor, a kind man with kind eyes, held out a framed certificate, his voice soft but steady. "For your service," he said, his words carrying across the hush, "and for your courage in defending not just a country, but the principle that sacrifice is never to be erased or denied." He handed the certificate to Arthur, and for a moment, the old man simply stood there, looking down at the paper in his hands. Daniel watched as Arthur lifted his head, his voice clear and sure despite the years. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly, each word as deliberate as the man himself. "But I'm grateful, not for the paper or the words, but for the reminder that when we stand together, no one's dignity has to stand alone." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd, like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. No one clapped, no one cheered. They just stood there, breathing in the moment, letting it settle into the bones of the town. When the ceremony ended, Daniel lingered by the edge of the park. He watched Arthur move slowly through the small crowd, shaking hands, trading soft words of thanks. There was no fanfare, no parade, just people, one by one, showing him the respect that had always been his. Daniel walked back to the courthouse alone that afternoon, the warm sun at his back. In the quiet of the clerk's office, he sat at his desk and let his eyes wander across the framed photos that lined the wall. Black and white images of soldiers and sailors, men and women who had worn the uniform long before Arthur ever did. Their faces were young and proud, their eyes steady even in stillness. He thought of the weight they'd carried. The quiet courage of standing up when it was easier to sit down. The unspoken promise that no matter how the years might try to bury it, dignity would always find a way to rise. Daniel picked up his pen and wrote Arthur's name one last time. Not in a ledger or a file, but in a small notebook he kept tucked away in his drawer, a place for stories, not judgments. He wrote it carefully, letting each letter settle into the page like a quiet vow. Outside, the leaves of the old oak tree fluttered in the breeze. The world felt softer, somehow, more honest. And in that small stillness, Daniel understood something he'd never been taught in any classroom. There are battles that don't leave scars you can see. Fights fought in quiet rooms and silent stares, in the simple act of refusing to let someone else's comfort erase your truth. Arthur Hale had fought that kind of battle, and he had won. The story of it didn't end there, of course. It lived on in the veterans who stood shoulder to shoulder in the cold, in the neighbors who remembered that a man's dignity wasn't something that could be ordered away by a gavel, in the clerk who wrote it all down, because some stories matter more than any record of fines or judgments. Daniel closed his notebook and set it gently back in the drawer. He leaned back in his chair and let the last light of the afternoon spill across his desk. For a moment, he thought of Arthur's steady gaze, the weight of that Purple Heart, the quiet certainty of a man who knew what he stood for. And he thought of the words he would carry forward, the lesson that wouldn't fade. There are battles we fight with weapons, and those we fight with words. There are battles that test the body, and those that test the soul. And sometimes, The hardest ones are the battles no one else sees. Arthur Hale had stood in that courtroom, not to make a speech or demand a spotlight. He had stood because it was right, because the medal on his chest wasn't just his. It belonged to every man and woman who had ever been told to stand down, to be silent, to disappear. As Daniel walked home that evening, the last of the day's light fading into twilight, he carried those words with him. He knew he would carry them for a long time, because Arthur's fight had shown them all that dignity is not granted by any court, it is earned, and it is claimed, one quiet stand at a time. And in the end, Daniel thought, that's the kind of story worth remembering. That's the kind of story that reminds us who we are and what we owe to one another. A story of an old soldier in a small town. A story of quiet defiance and quiet respect. A story that proved, once and for all, that some battles never end, but they are always worth fighting. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.